Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to me on Locals, where you can support the channel directly, get updates on the channel's content, appearances I make on other shows, interact with the channel directly. As of last month, I got my first payout from Super Chats on AdSense, so I want to do a shout out to everybody that's donated, including Ori Samsonov, Denwo, OMG, Jimmy Boy, V Radio, Euthanasia, Minoan, Did We Fail, Oros Post, K. Lewis, and M. So thanks very much for all the supers. So apparently the way AdSense works is I get paid out every month if it's $100 or more. So obviously to make that viable, I'll need to grow the channel. Looks like though with the content that I'm producing and the favorable responses I've been getting from people, that shouldn't be as hard as it might seem. But yeah, so again, thanks for the super chats. It's been a nice supplement to the income from Locals. And I see we've already got Spindley and Nathan CJ Hood in. Thank you guys for being here. And so basically, just to sort of slowly edge into this while people show up, is in preparation for Sunday's movie review with Morgoth and Endeavor and Apostolic Majesty and Marcus, I did some reading of Carlyle about Oliver Cromwell because we reviewed the movie Cromwell 1970. And one of the things that I noticed with reading Carlyle is he uses the term simulacra and simulacrum, so they're kind of interchangeable terms. And what's interesting is, of course, this is like well over 100 years before Baudrillard, and it's also not exactly used in the way Baudrillard would use it. The way I think of it is the idea of the law of identity is very old, but Leibniz's higher refinement of it, which I've mentioned on other occasions with regards to AI and the soul and the brain and everything like that, is a more developed commentary on it. So clearly, as an idea, the simulacrum as an idea that it clouds things over, it covers things over, seems to be already in use, and it seems that Baudrillard is giving us a more concrete expression of it. And just to show how I think there's a relevancy with Carlyle's work to what I've been talking about already, I have a few quotes I want to open up with. And these are from On Hero Worship, The Priest is Hero, and then The King is Hero. Before the prophet can arise, who seeing through it knows it to be mere wood, many men must have begun dimly to doubt that it was little more. That is such a powerful quote, because you compare that with the opening chapter of Simulacra and Simulation, and Baudrillard says that at the level of Simulacra, people begin to believe that the God that it represents never existed. So it's a turn of phrase that I was really tuned into. He then says also, in all ways it behooved man to quit Simulacra and to return to fact. Cost what it might, that did behoove to be done. Now, in this case, fact, I think, can in some sense be construed as what Baudrillard called the desert of the real, that to which the Borgia map collapses back into, that which the Borgia map was merely a construct of. And then he says, Luther and his Protestantism is not responsible for the wars. The false simulacra that forced him to protest, they are responsible. Union, organization, spiritual, material, are far nobler than any popedom and feudalism in their truest days. I never doubt is coming for the world. Sure to come. But on fact alone, not on semblance and simulacrum, will it be able to either come or to stand when come. This is all very, very interesting with regards to its relation to Baudrillard. And so the other thing is, from the section on kings, there's an interesting quotation. The meaning of life here on earth might be defined as consisting in this: to unfold yourself, to work what thing you have the faculty for. It is a necessity for a human being. It is the first law of our existence. Well, that's sort of what I'm doing here on this channel, working out that faculty for which I have a gift. Now, let's begin with defining some words here that we're going to be using. So for Carlyle, he talks about sincerity versus insincerity, and a hero is sincere. Broadly speaking, sincerity indicates superior insight, seeing things as they are. In the Bible, with regards to David's men, when it gets to the men of Issachar, it says they had discernment to see the signs of the times. They could see things as they were. Insincerity he defines as You do not believe, you only believe that you believe. And so insincerity is rooted in the simulacrum, or more broadly speaking, the levels of simulation. And so he then says, as for the goal of the Reformation, in which his context is the hero as priest, in all this wild revolutionary work from Protestantism downwards, see the blessedest result preparing itself, not abolition of hero worship, but rather that I would call a whole world of heroes. If a hero means sincere man, why not every one of us be a hero? A world all sincere, a believing world. The like has been, the like will again be, cannot help being. So he seems to think that at some point we'll get beyond all the semblances and simulacrums to the truth, which again, he identifies with nature. I don't know to what extent his Reformed Christianity is a part of a romantic nature worship as well. Sometimes the words are used rather colorfully. But so we have sincerity and insincerity. Now, it behooves us to also just briefly redefine simulacra. And this is a quote from Baudrillard. Such would be the successive phases of the image. 1, it is a reflection of a profound reality. 2, it masks and denatures a profound reality. 3, it masks the absence of a profound reality. 4, it has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. And then level 4 is what we're talking about. As for my video last week on the machine as hermaphrodite, I defined the machine as the icon that does work. So in the way that the simulacrum volatilizes God in all referentials, the icon the machine, the icon that works, volatilizes man and nature, because it was hard to replace man and nature as long as the image was just this dumb idol that couldn't do anything. But as soon as the icon could work and move things, because I'm using work on the physics definition, the ability to move some mass a certain distance, well, then it could replace us in nature. And that's what it's been attempting to do. And so looking at all of this, the trouble, so let's sort of work from the top down. The struggle that we're facing right now is the struggle of, well, before I get into that, hello Minoan, hello Not Sure, hello Sunny Jim. The struggle that we're facing right now is against the forces of the simulacrum, and then most broadly, and then more narrowly, the machine. And the machine, as I've already defined, is the icon that does work. All of which leads to, if followed to its logical conclusion, the volatilization of everything, which can't happen. So, of course, at some point, the process will short circuit. The next step then is the machine seeks to rule everything through technique, which technique defined by Ellul is the idea that we should seek to maximize efficiency, not just in modes of production, which is what we often associate with machines, but also human organization, human arrangements. And so as people become fitted into these more unnatural situations, a la Illich and his idea of systems, and a la Veblen and his idea of the machine process, we get fitted into those things. And this is a brief recap on those. The idea of systems is that we are now a component cog of the broader machine. That's Illich. And then the machine process is by which we have this process that has to be constantly maintained, independent of the ebb and flow of natural events and courses, and interstitially adjusted. So it's a deeply unnatural place to be. Think of like just the eternal glow blue light of a laboratory. Doesn't change at all, unlike the sun, which rises and sets. All of which creates a radically alienating, deracinated feeling, which Ellul says, now we need to have technique to solve how people deal with this ennui. And so now we have advertising, right? And you can get into that with like Chomsky's manufacturing consent, the Adbusters commercial, you are the product. And so now, as the machine creates problems, the machine then solves problems in the same way it creates them, in this never-ending cascade effect. And one of the things that Ellul points out is that at this level, we can't really determine easily who's at fault, who's culpable, because everything is so denatured, so diffuse. And that's why it's so hard. It's almost like you are a prisoner in a spider web, in a gilded cage, and no matter which way you swing, you can't get out and you can't hit anything, but you're also stuck in place. but it's, a superficially, materially comfortable place to be. So looking at that what I'm starting to see here or notice, especially if you can join Carlyle with Baudrillard, is how do we beat the simulacrum? How do we beat this? Well, in part, the simulacrum generates insincere men who are non-heroes, and it's this lack of heroic spirit that has been the product of the simulacra that is one of the main reasons why it still exists, because the heroic man could see things as they are, see things as they, with insight, and then find a way to deal with it. So the first question then is, how do we find the sincere man? How do we get to the point of rightly divining the truth of things? And so that made me think about something I've talked about before, the sort of distinction with the inner battle and then virtue. So one of the things that many people have been saying, not just on the DR, but more broadly in America, politics in general, what do we do? Everything is going to pieces. So the first thing that I want to say is, where does this battle truly lie? Right now, I did a video a few weeks ago called the justification or in defense of the dove policy, and then there I argued more broadly that to win without fighting, the soft defeating the hard, the teachings of Tolstoy and others are sort of identifying where the heart of the problem is, the heart, right? So we can look at, if what I've noticed is if you look at these perennial traditions, both in Europe and in the Middle East and South Asia and in China, you find certain points of convergence. So, for example, one thing is with the Greeks, we have a concept called appetite in the Greek philosophies. With Hebrew, we have havel, which means vapor or cloud, breath. And then we have in the Vedic tradition, Maya, the powerful force that creates the cosmic illusion that the phenomenal world is real. For the Greeks, appetites is the desires that compete with each other and with reason. And we see that with Plato's Chariot, where, since the black horse represents appetite, the white horse represents spirit, the charioteer represents reason, and charioteer must control both. Now, what all three of these different perspectives are touching on is that what is actually put quite well by Mustafa Mond in Brave New World, which I touched on in Happiness versus Truth video. The idea that older men begin to come closer to God not because they're afraid of death, but because all the passions and appetites that clouded their reasoning and judgment are quieted as the body ages, so they can see God more clearly. And this idea that we're caught in a smoke or a web or a vapor of sensation and appetite and desire, which leads to confusion and self-destruction, in the same vein as C.S. Lewis, who appropriated the Tao from the Taoists for his book, The Abolition of Man. I will just call this Maya. This is sort of a non-standard definition. It's more an homage to Lewis. But the sense of Maya is what we're trapped in. And what nature itself can generate this, because nature and then our own natures are damaged. But what the simulacrum does is it hyper stimulates us so that we have an even more difficult time escaping the simulacrum, escaping the Maya. It's a prison that creates this Maya for us to live in. And in some sense, that's what insincerity is, right? It's believing that you believe. But why do you believe that you believe? Well, again, in part, because you're confused and distracted and turned against yourself. Because again, appetites can't be reasoned with. It's C.S. Lewis said in The Abolition of Man, man is abolished because the strongest appetites rule whoever the controllers of this technological system are, because they're not using reason to determine truth or falsity. And this is really essential, this idea that and it's throughout all the traditions, right? Now, what's different is how they explain man coming to that condition and how they explain man getting out of that condition. There's a wide variety of differences between the Greek, Hebrew, and Vedic and Chinese traditions on that. But they all agree that we're stuck in that condition. And that's a condition that most people today don't talk about. It's not talked about on the contemporary level. The most you might see it talked about is certain like far out there woo-woo esoteric, LARPers who pretend to be Buddhists or pretend to be Hindus, but are just like the American Tex-Mex version of them. The other thing that we see is that all of these traditions seem to converge on the idea that God himself is known independently of the image through the intellect or consciousness. So from the Life of Numa by Plutarch, we read, furthermore, his ordinances concerning images are altogether in harmony with the doctrine of Pythagoras. For that the philosopher maintained that the first principle of being was beyond sense or feeling, was invisible and uncreated, and discernible only by the mind. And in like manner, Numa forbade the Romans to revere an image of God, which had the form of a man or a beast. Nor was there among them in earlier times any painted or graven likeness of the deity. But while for the first 170 years they were continually building temples and establishing sacred shrines, they made no statues in bodily form for them, convinced that it was impious to liken higher things to lower, and that it was impossible to apprehend the deity except by the intellect. Okay, so that's Pythagoras, that's Numa, that's Plutarch, who's himself a Platonist. So this is a very important philosophical strand of the Western philosophical tradition. Now, what does the Vedic tradition say about the material world and our ability to see God? This is the definition of Maya, that which appears to be whole but is made of parts, appears permanent but is temporary, from the root ma, to create an appearance using separate parts, and miti, to measure. The root ma gives us the English word mathematics, magic, the art of illusion, and mage, one who sees beyond illusion. In the Vedas, matter is studied because it is real, but it is also seen to be a temporary manifestation and a reflection of a higher transcendent reality. Like a mirage, an object is not what or whence it appears to be. And then for the Vedic tradition, to escape all of this, moksha, the Sanskrit word moksha, also called mukti, means liberation, ultimate freedom, release going beyond all material limitations. The final goal of all yoga is the release of the Atman. So, and then China, and then the Chinese traditions, God is likened to heaven. Heaven is, expanse. You can't contain it. It's above the earth. It's not defined. It's not rooted in something physical. And we even see this with the esoteric Masonic traditions, like the higher level Masons will freely admit, for the lower level schlubs, we'll tell them that God is the sun. And then if they get a little bit higher, we'll tell them, well, no, the sun represents qualities of God. And then they'll say, well, no, actually, the true God way, way at the top, which they also tell you was Lucifer for them, is just beyond form. And so this idea that on the one hand, we're all stuck in this web of illusion, which more broadly I call Maya, in a non-standard sense. I'm sort of using Lewis as an example here. And then that God is not perceived in the physical. We also see this when Pompey the Great goes into Jerusalem and finds the temple empty. He's like, whoa, what's up with this? There's no idols to smash. It leaves him, gobsmacked. Because ultimately that's how you break the cycle of the death of God, is right as Baudrillard says, the icon volatilizes God and creates the impression that God was never there. In fact, Simulacrum is a sort of theater of death. Once you get to that level, you kill the thing, and it's a sort of theater of death. And the only way to break that theater of death is to not have the simulacrum at all. Now, of course, in our modern age, we have the machine, which is an extension of all that, and the machine is doing all these things. So then how do we fight the machine? Because any to use the modern military terminology of the U.S. Army, any force-on-force conflict will fail. They've all failed before. So then the question is, well, how does the machine stay in power? Well, two ways. Back to my video, Truth versus Happiness, there's this idea that in order to be happy, we have to, give up the truth. Okay, well, what's giving up the truth? That's insincerity, because the sincere man seeks the truth. But then, okay, then in what does this happiness consist? The signs and symbols and magic that we see. We saw this with the Grand Inquisitor, right? People were happy with all the rituals that the Inquisitor was imposing on everyone. And so the simulacrum's bargain with us is that it makes us happy at the expense of the truth. But also, it makes us codependent on it so that we can't live without it, which is what many tech skeptics have feared and warned about. The other way it controls us is by manipulating our baser instincts, because as Aristotle said, our appetites are limitless and cannot be gratified to the nth degree. We should be learned to restrain them. But through media manipulation and marketing and commercials, going back to American Prosperity by Paul Mazur, we have this idea that by manipulating people's sense of fear and death and overall inadequacy, sex and death and overall inadequacy, we can get them to buy things that they don't really need. I mean, for example, if we stop consuming, this whole thing would stop tomorrow. That's not going to happen because people are enslaved to Maya and they can't quit consuming. They can't quit being happy at the expense of the truth. So they're insincere people stuck on the simulacrum. And so then, well, what do we do? How do we fight this? Well, going back to the idea of sincerity, rightly divining the way things truly are, we have to see, well, where does this war start? Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the first volume of the Gog Archipelago says that, I'm paraphrasing it, but it'd be so much nicer if evil was just some group of guys over there, that we could just, quarantine and kill and be done with it. But evil cuts through all men's hearts. And who's going to destroy a part of his heart? So part of this is what we need to do is realize that to the extent that we are participating beyond necessity, because of course we didn't necessarily consent to be born into this mess. And to some extent, we have to accommodate ourselves to it. But beyond necessity, if we continue to do so, or rather we should cease to continue to do so in order to effectively fight it. Because the first thing is we have to see this, right? Insight. All of the connections that I've just made, which are the result of insight, which is, again, the definition of the sincere man, which is also seeing things as they are, what Carlyle called nature. That's the first step. Second step is realizing where the battle starts. So to use a classic analogy, we could say that beginning in, June 1944, the first phases of the end of the World War II began on D-Day, but it went all the way to, the Elbe River for the Western Allies. So the first step was to get an amphibious operation to land on the beaches of Normandy. Well, the equivalent of the first operation is the battle that's going on in your soul. Your soul is already enmeshed in the Maya and is already confused and is already dealing with all of these issues, conflicting appetites, not being able to see clearly because of either, moral weakness or stress or being overworked. And that's where the battle needs to start, which ties into my video about the dove strategy, which I call, the highest form of war, because all war starts in the soul. James says that you lust and do not have, and that's where wars come from. Desire, right? Desire beyond reach or desire beyond warrant is where wars start. And so the first thing you have to do is learn how to deal with that. Now, obviously, those of us who are Christians, myself and those in the audience, we have a very specific understanding with regards to Christ and sanctification and repentance and all of these things, which are, of course, I would argue the true way to deal with this problem, but this is beyond the scope of this discussion. I think there are methods you can use. I mean, for example, the ancient pagans like Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher, Plotinus, who was a Platonist ascetic, can achieve relatively high levels of moral rectitude by their own efforts, which again, I don't believe will save them. But on the other hand, it's better than, being completely swallowed up in this Maya and being ground into the dust by the machine. So, and what we can do with this is figure out how to, not only within ourselves, but also within others, how to break the spell of Maya. Now, in ourselves, we can begin by understanding the concept of the four virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, courage, and how by creating what Aristotle would say habits, constructive habits that cause us to act in this way, we begin through small steps, through the ratchet effect, to eventually embody these principles without having to think about them. Right? So the goal is to not constantly having to be thinking about, am I going to resist this temptation over here? Right? The goal is to just be, to not have to do that, because what you're already doing is such that you're not having to constantly deal with that issue over there. And that's the whole point of habit forming and for Aristotle, but in the Eastern traditions, that's the whole point of, doing by not doing, right? You're not actively willing to do the thing. It's almost spontaneous now. You've reached a level of spontaneity with doing that thing that you ought to be doing in the first place. And that could all be a series of lectures and topics on themselves. But that's the first step. The second step is, how do you get other people to see that? So, for example, in Proverbs 25, 21, 22, Solomon says, if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For so you will heap coals of fire on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Paul repeats this in Romans. We also see, I forget which dialogue it was. I covered it with Logos and Andrew when we did Plato for a while before Andrew's schedule made that too difficult. Plato basically says, the people that are doing me harm, the Athenians, it would be the morally unethical thing to do wrong back to them, because it's sort of like two wrongs don't make a right. But it's also the idea that Plato was trying to be an example for the Athenians so that they would learn from his example. And this sort of, what we might say more broadly, non-confrontational strategy, which we see in the Old Testament in a very sort of shadowy form. Isaac does this when Abimelech drives him from the wells. We see this more clearly with Christ. In the Eastern traditions, of course, we see this with Buddha. We see this with Lao Tzu. We see this in the West with Plato. All of these great thinkers are realizing that the real fight, the real battle, is at the spiritual level, to liberate men from this distracting Maya so that they can think clearly and act rationally, to quote, be in their right mind. An exaggerated example of this is when Christ casts out the demon from the Gennesaret demoniac. And it says that he was in his right mind. Well, obviously, this guy was demon-possessed and had a lot more than just his own Maya to worry about. But the idea is that by doing something good, it's the one thing that breaks through. It's that soft, overcoming the hard. It breaks through the hardness of the people that are stuck in their own lusts and appetites and confusion. Because what ends up happening is, if you fight fire with fire, you end up starting a fire that burns everything down. A really good example of this is, I don't remember the episode name, but there's an episode of Samurai Jack where he's having a bad day and he gets mad and throws his sandal at basically a poster of wanting his arrest, which then turns into a evil doppelganger Jack, and they start fighting each other. And the more Jack fights and the more he fights, the evil Jack doesn't skip a beat. He's just as strong. Only when Samurai Jack realizes that he has to just completely separate from this, just not respond in kind, does the evil Jack go away. And that's a cartoon, I know, but there's actually a really profound statement there that is coming through all of this. And again, it's, I think, most clearly articulated in Christianity, but I think you can see it again in Greek tradition, even Roman tradition. You can see it in the Vedic and Chinese traditions at sort of what I would call the elite level of the thinkers. So the other thing then is, okay, so that's on an interpersonal level, how we can begin to think about the process of extricating ourselves from Maya, starving the machine, at least of our support, and then getting through to others so that they can see what a trap and web that they're in. Because again, ultimately, being, from my earlier discussions of the machine, the goal of the machine is to just destroy everything. It's gonna volatilize everything. And so the best you can do is get out of the way, and if you want to fight back, starve it, because a direct confrontation won't work. But again, it's that Taoist principle: the soft overcomes the hard. So the soft response is starving it out. Don't directly challenge it, but eventually it will fall. And we've seen them, and also, as the Tao says, it works for the evil and the good. So we saw the left use this to take over all the institutions in the West to become hegemonic. I mean, the fact that they didn't have to fire a shot doesn't matter. They're hegemonic now. So it shows you how powerful it can be with a dedicated force behind it, whether it's for good or for evil. But what I think is the real next step for, like, more broadly beyond just the individual level. What do we do as a group? What can be done as a group? Well, in his little alt history trip, Livy talks about what if Alexander had fought the Romans, and he goes on this excursus. But he makes 2 points which I think are pretty profound. He says, obviously a genius like Hannibal or an Alexander is more than a match for another general one-on-one. But he says that they're not more than a match for a system. And he points to the Roman Republic as an organized system that ultimately had more staying power and overthrew Hannibal. Now, obviously, Hannibal and the Romans fought a lot of what we call force-on-force conflicts. They really had at it. It was hard versus hard. Rome eventually won, but at great cost. Now, what I'm arguing for is that Livy's correct, but to scale this up, so for the kind of battles and wars Livy's talking about, we're at the level of Maya. We're just fighting, each other rather than the actual causes of these conflicts. So imagine having a system like the Romans, but instead of, training, legionaries, we sort of trained intellectual or spiritual legionaries who were organized in this professional way to solve problems, to find nonviolent solutions to these problems, but fight to pull people out of Miles, right? To use a cheesy movie analogy, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Anakin Skywalker, "You can't beat me, I have the high ground." Well, exactly. Once you've left Maya, you have the high ground. And you can't ultimately lose, because those beneath you are the ones that will be harming themselves more than they harm you. That might actually be what Alec Guinness was getting at in episode 4 as Obi-Wan Kenobi, when he tells Darth Vader, "If you kill me, I'll become stronger than ever." I think that might be what he's getting at. And so to go back to Mustafa Mond, what would be one of the key aspects of this organization is, instead of waiting for the desires to die naturally in old age, in which time, most of your best years are behind you, to create a system that through discipline and education and rigor gets people to overcome those earlier in life and build a sense of collegiality and solidarity and fraternity such that we can work together as an organized body, and then also work to overcome all of these issues. And so, I mean, this is in a fully idealized form. Again, I don't see this happening anytime soon. Well, what I would imagine is, in order to fight the simulacrum, to fight the machine, the first step, create this organization that would pull the people out of their own Maya and then educate them, create, a sort of rigid training process of self-denial, possibly fasting and other sort of rituals and practices in order to get them on the same page and able to see things clearly, i.e. be sincere. And then to fight the machine by starving it. And by starving it, then you pull people out. It's like, because the biggest problem is, where do you go? I mean, let's say you wake up to all of this and people are like, that's a good question. I don't know where to go. It doesn't exist yet. But there needs to be a place where we can find these, sincere, where we can create sincere men free from the influence, or at least minimizing the influence of the simulacra itself, so that we can then create a space to pull people into and then continue to grow in the expanse or under the shadow of the machine. Because if the machine grows and grows and grows, it can't actually surveil everything. It becomes functionally impossible, right? Even in the Left Behind series, where the Antichrist can ship you and track you everywhere, there's still people that can hide, because there always will be. The machine can never be omniscient or omnipotent, though it has aspirations to be such. And so when we look at that, we can say, okay, so this is what I would like to see then. And if we just run this out to its logical conclusion, you pull enough people out of the system this way that the machine starves to death and collapses. Now that's an ideal situation. I think it's far more likely that the machine would destroy itself due to its own internal contradictions, i.e. volatilizing the very things it needs for its own existence, because it isn't its own existence. It has aspirations of being so, but nature is what exists. God is what exists. And so it can't actually replace them. But that being said, I think that even if, a victory of this kind is impossible, for those of us that survive the collapse of the machine, this kind of thing is what will be necessary in order to have the kind of future that we would want and that we would want for future generations. So looking at all of that, I think that there's the other thing I wanted to add too that I forgot to bring up was Dune and the Butlerian Jihad. One of the things about the Butlerian Jihad that is interesting is that there seems to be the idea that the machines were replacing humans, the machines that could think. And what Frank Herbert was getting at was that it led to laziness. It led to a crutch, and that in what he wanted the Butlerian Jihad to represent was humanity removing that crutch, so that it could develop more fully, right? By removing all these machines and computers, they were then able to have, the Imperium, the great houses, the Mentats, the Spacing Guild, the Bene Gesserit, and they were all developed in these, human capacities that were greater than they would have otherwise been. Now, this isn't quite the same as Carlyle's insincerity, but it's interesting in the sense that Herbert is agreeing with Carlyle that the machine, or the simulacrum, if you will, holds us back. Now, he doesn't elaborate on this as much because it's not a work of philosophy; it's a work of fiction with some philosophical elements. But so I'm not sure if Frank Herbert is actually saying that, we are insincere or less. Well, in one sense, we're less complete because we haven't fully developed our potentials. That isn't quite the same as having insight to see things as they are. I think that many of the characters in Dune believe that they do see the things as they are, but that's not really here nor there. But what's interesting is that the Butlerian Jihad itself is a war against machines, a force-on-force conflict. Well, now obviously it's a science fiction book. You're not meant to think about it too hard, but it's kind of like, how would that work? How would the people that reject technology beat technology? Because in Earth history, it goes all one way. Those with the technology seem to win. I guess you could say that Afghanistan was an exception with the Taliban, but I think the really interesting thing is what if we had a narrative, maybe science fiction, where we have a kind of like parallel Butlerian Jihad, but instead of like this force-on-force war that rages throughout the galaxy, we have this sort of like indirect approach where people are basically pulled out of the system into this, order, into this organization that I've hinted at. And, gradually through these indirect measures of the soft overcoming the hard and the gentle answer turning away wrath, they eventually starve it to extinction. So I don't disagree with Herbert that we need something like this to free humanity. But I think that Herbert hasn't really considered all of the ramifications of a war against the machine and how that would work. Because again, I don't think a direct attack on the machine could work. But ultimately, this is the other problem, right? This is the problem we have with the revolution in like the leftist thinking. Oh, well, everything is just the result of material conditions. So if we just had another revolution, then we'd fix it all. But the root is the man's heart, right? It's so Bakunin said that, if there was a socialism, state socialism rather than, anarchism, they would just have a red czar that would be worse than the czar. And he's right, because ultimately the human condition hasn't changed, or the people utilizing the power levers haven't changed. And so this idea that if we just get rid of this or that thing in and of itself will fix everything doesn't follow, because ultimately the thing that we're dealing with is itself in power and controlling us because we let it control us. In his letter to a Hindu, Tolstoy says the reason why the 300 million Indians were allowed to be ruled by the East India Company was because they were accustomed to the rule of violence, and that the East India Company, being the best practitioner of violence, therefore gained a sort of legitimacy over the Rajas. And so their subjects were like, hey, look, you're just the biggest, baddest Raj in town. We'll just sign up with you. And so the system repeated itself. And so the next thing is, okay, well, what does that look like with the machine? Well, just like with Bakunin's warning about the red czar. We don't want to have just another group of guys that do this all over again. I mean, eliminating the machine is necessary for other things to happen and to avoid worse outcomes. But we don't want it to be replaced by a similar, like the Who said, the old boss is the same as the new boss. The new boss is the same as the old boss. We don't want that. So just in brief, in closing, we are all stuck in this smoke of illusion, Maya, and we're already stuck in that with the sort of infirm, defective hardware itself, because we're flawed, fallen, however you want to interpret that. But all these traditions would agree that we are stuck in this. They disagree how we got there. They also agree that we're somehow hampered, sometimes by our own hand, to get out of it, and that getting out of it's the goal. And one part that they all agree on is self-control. Self-control, as Tolstoy says, is the first condition of virtue. You can't be a virtuous man before then. And all these great traditions would agree on that principle. And then from there, we realize that the simulacrum and the machine, which is an extension of it, needs to be escaped for all the reasons that have been stated. We can first begin to escape it by participating as little as possible within it, by beginning the process of uprooting ourselves from Maya to see things as they really are, which is sincerity. And that will develop proportionally as far as we pull ourselves out, because it's only within the shadow of the simulacra that we have insincerity. And the next thing is working on building habits that overcome these baser instincts, which cloud our judgments, so that we can see things as they are. And then in order to get other people out, we follow the indirect path of the soft defeating the hard and rewarding good for evil, or evil for good, so that we can overcome, we can break through, right? Because hard versus hard, it's not going to break through. But that little soft, thing you put in there is going to finally get through. You planted a seed. Or rather, it might not necessarily get through, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to get through. And then if you can get enough people through, then you build an organization, or work on building an organization, IRL, where people live together and live in community such that they impose on themselves these strictures and rules in order to get to the point of the old man to see God clearly while they're 20 rather than 60. And then begin the process of starving the machine. So that's tonight's lecture. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Don't forget to, again, like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell and check me out on Locals. And also Twitter. On Twitter, I give notifications for all my videos. Let's check out the chats. Let's see. Tim, not sure. Tim 1AMBTW. Don't know who Tim is, but okay. Fun Smart. Storytelling around the campfire was the original simulation. Was it the original simulation? Maybe it was. Tex Swami. There we go. Yeah, that's good to know. King Salmonfish. It makes me ponder Longinomi trying to protect humanity by suppressing them so the anti-spirals wouldn't kill us due to the risk of our potential from urinating it. Let's see here. Curiosity Closet. A lot of Platonism going around here. Curiosity Closet. I prefer Epicurean ethics. Jacob J. I think the episode is called Jack versus Jack. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks. Oh yeah, Jacob J. Hello. Curiosity Closet. Surely the machine is reason. The crux of philosophy is the demon. No. The way I define the machine, well, I mean, Ilua has his own definition, which is also a solid one, but it's the icon that does work. Because otherwise, you can't seek to replace man and nature unless you can do work. Because cars use horsepower. It's tied to the work they do. So let's see. Curiosity closet, Eros is love, is a flaccid concept, and Eros is unreason. Well, no. Eros is the highest expression of reason, where you midwife an idea. In the Theaetetus and the Symposium, Plato discusses that. Let's see here. King Salmonfish. Yeah, it's a balance. Todd is belling it out of control right now. Thanks, man. Friend of Crows. I'm trying to break free from the machine, but boy, oh boy, it's hard and lonely path. Tell me about it. Yeah, I know. I've been on this path for over 20 years now and didn't know where it was ending up or what I was trying to escape until now. Let's see here. Minoan. IMO, the internet is allowing many to see through the machine, but the internet is part of the machine spinning wheels. Well, yeah, you see, that's what's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, it's true that the internet is the simulacrum, is the machine, but it also reveals things about itself as it expands and grows at each iteration that maybe it doesn't want to, but it kind of can't help it, because there's kind of this occult principle where they tell you what they're going to do to you before they do it, as a sort of way to get you to consent. A really good example of this principle is the Pink Floyd song "The Machine," where it says something to the effect, "What did you dream, my son? Don't worry, we told you what to dream." They're telling you that, look, we're supposed to be these edgy rock stars, but we're really all controlled by these guys behind the scenes telling you what to say. So it's like mask off. They're telling you what they're doing in a way to like get you to tacitly consent. Forge Warhammer, AI Simulacrum. Yeah. Dorian Gray. The Boy Scouts used to be dedicated to doing just this, creating strong, independent, and competent leaders for the next generation. Now they are focused on making better cogs for the machine. Well, there you go. Curiosity Closet. What if Socrates is a mob, though? I don't know what you mean by that. Minoan. Isn't Maya just the state of fallen man? Pulling one out of the fog would be death and ascending to heaven. Well, not necessarily. I mean, in the sense that I'm using it in the sort of again an homage to Lewis. It's just that fog that we're in. The fallen state is the sort of the distinction here is this, right? There's the fallen state that we're in, where we have inclinations and desires that are bent away from the good. That's internal to us. But then there's the things that are around us that deceive us and confuse us and are smoke and vapor that are just, blinding the eyes and confusing the senses. That's what I'm talking about. Spindly, thanks. Let's see. Forge Warhammer. Didn't a lot of medieval Christians accuse the Cathars and dissenters like the lawyers of Epicureanism? That I am not sure. Curiosity Closet. I'm coming from the Nietzschean side of things, but appreciate the thoughts, man. Well, thank you. King Salmonfish for $3.50. Payment for a service to humanity rendered. Thanks, King Salmonfish. Minoan. The Boy Scouts were formed to make better soldiers starting in youth. Yeah, that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, that something like that rigorous discipline would be necessary, but I'm arguing for a different cause, a different focus. I guess you could say, mastering the sort of, soft path, if you will, the indirect path. Let's see here. Forge Warhammer, definitely do not want to have a neural link. This tech is getting sort of borderline monstrous. Yes. Boyo Poyo, what are your thoughts on occultism and its legacy? Well, a lot of occultism, I mean, there's a lot of it that's just kind of like woo-woo. But like the more like serious Hermetic traditions, they seem to be, there's kind of like two things that people do. The one group will be, we know that God is not perceived through the image, but we want to keep this knowledge secret. And we'll just create, these ordered hierarchies, priests that suppress the knowledge. You'll see this with like secret societies. I mean, the Masons do this. Or you'll see it as a sort of like bone. Okay, we'll throw you a bone. Oh, these people, they have to have this. They want the image so bad. It's like when Smith the Savage tries to throw the Soma out of their hands. They attack him. And it's like, dude, they want the slavery. That's where it gets hard. That's where it gets hard. So, fun smart. Metaverse not even once. Exactly. Well, it looks like we're at the end of the show today, guys. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.